It was late afternoon in the heart of the city, where the streets carried the weight of countless untold stories. On the corner of a busy intersection, beneath the faded shadow of an old brick building, sat a man whose clothes had long since lost their shape. His shoes were worn thin, his hands calloused, and his eyes, though tired, still held a quiet fire. His name was Elijah Carter. People passed him every day without knowing that, not long ago, he had once stood in front of boardrooms wearing tailored suits, signing contracts that could change a man's fortune overnight. But life, in all its unpredictability, had stripped him of everything: his wealth, his home, and even the belief that tomorrow might be better. That afternoon, Elijah was holding a simple cardboard sign. On it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Do you also cry from hunger?" People glanced at it, some with pity, others with annoyance, as if his presence disturbed their comfortable rhythm. Most walked past without stopping. But Elijah didn't write that question for coins. He wrote it for connection. Because hunger, he knew, wasn't just about an empty stomach. It was about dignity. Among the strangers that day, one man did stop. He was sharply dressed, wearing a gold watch that caught the sunlight. His name was David Thompson, a self-made businessman who had risen from the same streets Elijah now sat on. David studied the sign for a moment, his brow furrowed, as if the question struck a nerve. "Brother," David said quietly, "I used to cry from hunger. But not just the kind you feel in your belly, the kind you feel in your soul." Elijah looked up slowly. For the first time that day, someone wasn't just seeing a beggar. They were seeing him. The two men began to talk, and as the noise of the city faded into the background, Elijah's story unfolded. Years ago, he had been a respected small business owner. He worked long days and longer nights to provide for his family. His pride wasn't in his earnings. It was in being a man his young son could look up to. But fate, cruel and relentless, had other plans. A string of bad investments, a dishonest business partner, and an economic downturn wiped out everything he had built. Still, Elijah could endure poverty. What he couldn't endure was the night tragedy knocked on his door. His only son, Jamal, had been caught in the crossfire of a senseless shooting, a life stolen in a moment of violence that left a father hollowed out from the inside. That night, the city mourned another statistic. But Elijah wasn't counting numbers. He was burying his future. In the months that followed, he lost the will to rebuild. He wandered from shelter to shelter, not because he was weak, but because grief had robbed him of the anchor that once kept him steady. And now, here he was, on a corner, holding a sign, asking strangers if they too knew what it meant to ache in ways the body alone could not describe. David listened in silence. He recognized the depth of the man's wounds. "Elijah," he said finally, "I can't bring your son back. But I know what it's like to have the world close its doors on you. I know what it's like to be invisible." What happened next was not charity. David didn't just drop a bill in Elijah's cup and walk away. He invited him to a cafe across the street, bought him a warm meal, and handed him a business card. "Come see me tomorrow," he said. "Let's start again." The next morning, Elijah stood outside David's office, hesitant. Years of rejection had made him cautious. But when the receptionist smiled and let him in, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. David offered him a job, not as a favor, but because he believed in redemption. At first, Elijah swept floors and stocked shelves in one of David's warehouses. But over time, his natural leadership and work ethic began to shine again. Co-workers noticed, David noticed. And slowly, piece by piece, Elijah began to rebuild his life. But the real transformation wasn't in his bank account. It was in his spirit. He started volunteering at community centers, speaking to young men about resilience, about how dignity is worth more than gold, and about how grief doesn't have to be the end of a story. Months turned into years. Elijah saved enough to rent a small apartment. Then one day, David walked into the warehouse with a set of keys and handed them to Elijah. "You've earned more than just a paycheck," he said. "You've earned a future." Those keys weren't for a car or a room. They were for a small storefront David had bought in Elijah's name. "You once built something from nothing," David said. "It's time you did it again." The business Elijah opened wasn't just for profit. It was a place for second chances. He hired people who had been homeless, people who had been incarcerated, people who knew what it meant to be written off. And on the wall, above the counter, he hung his old cardboard sign. "Do you also cry from hunger?" When customers asked about it, Elijah would tell them, "That question once saved my life, because it reminded me that no matter how far we fall, there's always someone willing to see you as more than your worst day." And though he would never stop mourning his son, Elijah found a new kind of purpose, one that turned pain into power and loss into legacy. Because sometimes the most powerful riches a man can have aren't in his pocket, they're in his heart.